Don't plant what the market wants. Plant what the sky is willing to grow. Eli Dawson's father repeated those words every spring, even after most farmers across western Kansas stopped planting sorghum in favor of maize. Whenever neighbors talked about higher yields, stronger hybrids, or better market prices, his father would simply smile, look toward the horizon, and remind Eli that no farmer had ever argued successfully with the weather. As a boy, Eli thought the advice belonged to another generation, but by the summer of 1988, it would become the only reason his family still had something growing in their fields. The laughter began long before the drought. When Eli planted nearly half his acreage in sorghum, instead of following everyone else into maize, neighbors joked that he was farming 20 years behind the rest of the county. Even the local elevator manager asked whether he planned to harvest grain or collect memories because, in the minds of most people, sorghum belonged to the past, while maize represented the future. Then the rain stopped. Week after week, the clouds drifted across western Kansas without leaving enough moisture to matter. The topsoil hardened. Deep cracks spread across the fields, and the green maize that had looked so promising in early June slowly curled beneath the relentless summer heat. Through it all, Eli continued walking his sorghum every evening, saying very little because he remembered something his father had taught him years earlier. A good farmer doesn't spend the growing season wishing the weather had been different. He learns to work with the weather he has. By the time the harvest finally arrived, the people who had laughed at Eli weren't looking at his sorghum anymore. They were looking at the seed it had quietly produced because, after one of the harshest droughts the county had ever endured, that seed had become far more valuable than anyone could have imagined. For the next several months, Eli Dawson would watch one pickup truck after another turn into his driveway, carrying farmers who had spent the spring laughing at his decision to plant sorghum. None of them came to argue, none came to criticize, and none came pretending they had supported him all along because the drought had settled every debate the weather could settle. They came carrying quiet hope, wondering whether the one crop they had dismissed only a few months earlier might now offer them a way to begin again. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from, so leave your town, state, or country in the comments below. One of my favorite parts of this channel is seeing people from farming communities and small towns all over the world come together to share their stories. I'm also putting together a free Last Acre story archive featuring 25 forgotten rural stories, the real historical inspirations behind many of our videos, behind-the-scenes research notes, fascinating historical discoveries, and exclusive story ideas you won't find on the channel. I'll be sharing it first through the Community tab, so if you'd like to get it when it's ready, make sure you're subscribed and turn on notifications so you don't miss the announcement. Now, let's get back to the story. The answer didn't begin with the drought, the failed maize harvest, or the long line of pickups that eventually appeared outside Eli's farmhouse. It began many years earlier, when a young boy walked beside his father through a field of knee-high sorghum and heard a piece of advice that sounded old-fashioned at the time, but would one day become the difference between surviving one of the hardest growing seasons western Kansas had ever endured and watching an entire year's work disappear beneath an empty sky. By the spring of 1988, planting season across Gove County, Kansas, followed a pattern that hardly anyone questioned anymore because years of improving maize hybrids, encouraging market prices, and several successful harvests had convinced most farmers that maize represented the future of grain production across the high plains. Every conversation at the local cooperative seemed to reach the same conclusion before long. Seed representatives confidently promoted newer varieties capable of producing record yields, and neighboring farmers compared planting plans with the quiet optimism that usually accompanies a string of favorable seasons. Looking around the county, it was difficult to find anyone who believed grain sorghum still deserved the amount of land it had occupied only a generation earlier, and with each passing year, more acres disappeared beneath maize because the numbers appeared too convincing to ignore. Eli Dawson understood exactly why so many people had embraced that change, because he wasn't opposed to progress, nor was he the kind of farmer who clung to old methods simply because his father had used them. Over the previous several years, he had invested in better equipment whenever the farm could justify the expense, adopted conservation practices that reduced erosion without sacrificing productivity, and tested improved seed varieties whenever experience suggested they genuinely belonged on his land. Nobody who knew Eli would have described him as old-fashioned, which was precisely why his planting decisions became the subject of so many conversations every spring. While neighboring farms steadily increased the amount of maize they planted, Eli continued devoting nearly half of his acreage to grain sorghum, and although nobody considered the decision reckless, very few people believed it made good business sense anymore. Those opinions followed him almost everywhere during planting season, but they became especially noticeable on the Saturday morning when farmers gathered at the local cooperative to collect seed before heading into the fields. As pallets of maize disappeared onto trailers one after another, forklift operators eventually brought out several pallets of certified sorghum seed for Eli, prompting one neighboring farmer to grin and ask whether he intended to farm the future or preserve the past. Another joked that the only thing still growing faster than sorghum was nostalgia, and the small group nearby shared an easy laugh because nobody meant the comments maliciously. They respected Eli, admired how carefully he managed his farm, and genuinely believed they were watching an intelligent young farmer limit his own earning potential by refusing to let go of a crop that seemed to belong to another era. Eli laughed along with them, thanked the cooperative staff for loading the trailer, and wished everyone a safe planting season because he had learned years earlier that arguing with confident opinions before the weather had its turn rarely accomplished anything. The following morning dawned cool and clear as Eli guided the planter across the first field scheduled for sorghum, while his hired hand, 23-year-old Ben Harper, followed behind with the seed tender. Ben had worked alongside Eli long enough to know that every decision on the Dawson farm had a reason behind it. Yet he couldn't understand why they were planting sorghum while nearly every neighboring planter was filling fields with maize. After watching another line of tractors working across the section road beside them, he finally admitted that the question had been bothering him since they loaded seed at the cooperative, explaining that if maize promised higher returns during good years, he couldn't understand why they continued committing so much valuable ground to a crop most people believed had already been left behind. Eli listened without dismissing the question because he remembered asking his own father something remarkably similar many years earlier. Instead of answering immediately, he brought the tractor to a stop near the edge of the field, climbed down from the cab, and walked several steps across the freshly planted ground until he reached an area where the soil had been turned only a few hours before. Crouching quietly, he gathered a handful of loose earth, rubbed it slowly between his fingers, and watched the finest particles disappear into the steady spring breeze before lifting his eyes toward the western horizon. Ben waited patiently, expecting an explanation about seed prices or grain markets, but Eli simply smiled and observed that the ground was starting the season thirsty, even though rain had fallen less than a week earlier, and shallow puddles still lingered beside several gravel roads throughout the county. Ben looked across the field without seeing anything unusual, because to him the soil appeared exactly as it should have at the beginning of another promising spring. Yet the quiet confidence in Eli's voice suggested he had noticed something that couldn't be measured by a weather report alone. As the planter eased forward and the first rows of sorghum disappeared beneath the Kansas soil, Ben found himself wondering whether the real difference between Eli and everyone laughing at the cooperative wasn't the crop they had chosen, but the way they had learned to look at the land before making that choice. Planting continued for nearly 2 weeks, and by the time the final rows disappeared beneath the Kansas soil, Eli Dawson had spent more hours inside a tractor cab than he cared to count. The routine was familiar enough that most days passed with very little conversation beyond checking seed depth, adjusting equipment, and watching the weather forecast each evening before planning the next day's work. Across Gove County there was a quiet confidence that seemed to grow alongside the newly planted fields because timely spring rainfall had allowed farmers to finish planting without major delays. Grain prices remained encouraging, and nearly everyone believed another productive season was already beginning to take shape. Looking across the countryside, there was very little to suggest that anything unusual lay ahead, yet Eli found himself paying less attention to the forecasts on the evening news than to the ground beneath his boots every morning before climbing into the tractor. Ben gradually noticed those small routines because they never changed. Before starting work, Eli always walked into whichever field they planned to plant that day, crouched beside the first pass, lifted a handful of soil into his palm, and quietly rubbed it between his fingers before saying anything at all. Some mornings he would smile and head back toward the equipment without another word, while on other mornings he would ask Ben to make small adjustments to planting depth or tractor speed that seemed insignificant at the time but always proved sensible by the end of the day. After watching those habits for several seasons, Ben finally admitted that he still couldn't understand how someone could learn so much from a handful of dirt, especially when weather forecasts, moisture reports, and university recommendations were available to every farmer in the county. Eli smiled because he remembered asking his own father almost the same question when he was about Ben's age. He explained that modern forecasts and scientific research had made farming better in countless ways, and no sensible farmer ignored them. But his father believed there was one mistake every generation was tempted to make. People became so confident in what the reports predicted that they slowly stopped paying attention to what the land itself was trying to say. He once told Eli that a field speaks a little differently every season, although it only speaks to people willing to spend enough time walking through it. And he often reminded him that good farmers watched the sky, while great farmers watched both the sky and the ground, because one could never be fully understood without the other. Those conversations came back to Eli throughout the remainder of planting season because, despite the encouraging forecasts, something about the fields unsettled him in a way he struggled to explain. The surface moisture looked adequate, recent rainfall had satisfied nearly everyone, and the county extension reports gave no reason for concern, yet each morning the soil beneath the top layer felt slightly drier than he expected for that time of year. The difference wasn't dramatic enough to alarm anyone else, and Eli certainly wasn't prepared to predict a drought on the basis of a few quiet observations, but years of farming beside his father had taught him that the land often whispered long before it shouted. Experience had also taught him that the earliest warnings were almost never obvious, because if they were, everyone would notice them. One evening, after finishing repairs on a section of fence bordering the sorghum field, Eli stood quietly watching the last light settle across the young seedlings that had only recently pushed through the soil. From a distance, they looked no different from countless other fields scattered across western Kansas, and anyone driving past would have seen nothing more than another ordinary spring beginning exactly as expected. Even Eli couldn't say with confidence that anything was wrong. Yet the uneasy feeling refused to leave him because the ground beneath his boots reminded him of seasons his father had spoken about years earlier, when promising springs slowly gave way to summers that tested every decision a farmer had made months before the first signs of trouble ever appeared. As he turned toward the farmhouse with the evening breeze carrying dry prairie dust across the field, he found himself hoping those old memories belonged to another generation, although something deep inside him quietly wondered whether this growing season was about to ask the same difficult questions all over again. By the middle of June, the confidence that had filled coffee shops and grain elevators throughout Gove County during planting season had begun giving way to quieter conversations because the weather had settled into a pattern that nobody particularly liked, even if few people were willing to admit they were becoming concerned. Small chances of rain appeared almost every week. Dark clouds occasionally gathered along the western horizon during the late afternoon, and more than once farmers climbed onto porch steps or stood beside pickup trucks believing a long-awaited storm had finally arrived. Yet the clouds repeatedly drifted north or dissolved before reaching the county, leaving behind little more than a brief breeze and the familiar disappointment of another evening ending with dry ground beneath their boots. At first, nobody called it a drought because farmers across western Kansas understood that dry weeks were simply part of life on the high plains. Crops had survived difficult starts before, and nearly everyone believed that one good soaking rain could still change the entire season. Sunday mornings after church, conversations often ended with someone glancing toward the sky before saying they would probably catch rain by the weekend, while the men gathered around the grain elevator continued discussing fertilizer, markets, and machinery, as though the weather would eventually fall back into its usual rhythm. Even Eli Dawson hoped they were right, because hope has always been one of the few things a farmer can afford in unlimited supply. Yet every evening he found himself walking farther into his fields before returning home, quietly searching for changes that seemed almost too small for anyone else to notice. The maize remained green, but it no longer carried the same confidence it had only a few weeks earlier. By late afternoon, the upper leaves began curling tightly against the heat before relaxing again after sunset, and although that response wasn't unusual during hot weather, Eli noticed it happening earlier each day and lasting a little longer than it had the day before. His sorghum showed signs of stress as well because no crop enjoys weeks without meaningful rainfall, but its leaves remained more open through the hottest part of the afternoon, and its roots continued pushing deeper into the soil in search of moisture that maize struggled to reach. Looking across both fields, Eli saw no reason to celebrate because one crop wasn't thriving while the other failed. They were simply fighting the same battle in different ways. The dry weather slowly reached beyond the fields into everyday life across the county. Dust lingered behind passing pickups long after they disappeared down gravel roads. Stock ponds settled lower against their banks with each passing week, and cattle gathered more frequently around water tanks as pasture grass lost the rich green color it normally carried into early summer. Older farmers who had lived through difficult seasons spent longer studying the horizon before driving home each evening, while younger producers continued trusting the forecasts that promised better chances of rain just a few days away. Nobody could honestly say which group was right, because farming has always demanded equal measures of optimism and patience, but the land itself was becoming harder to ignore. One evening, after checking several fields before sunset, Ben climbed into the pickup beside Eli without speaking for nearly a mile. The silence lasted until they reached the county road, where he finally admitted that the maize across the neighborhood didn't look quite as healthy as it had only 2 weeks earlier, and asked whether the crop had already begun slipping beyond recovery. Eli kept his eyes on the road for several moments before answering, because he refused to pretend he knew more than he did. He explained that crops often survived difficult starts if the weather changed in time, and nobody would gain anything by surrendering to fear before the season had finished telling its story. His father used to remind him that a farmer never gives up before the crop does, and although those words had carried him through more than one uncertain year, he quietly wondered whether they were about to be tested more severely than at any time since he first took over the Dawson farm. As they turned into the long gravel driveway leading home, Eli looked once more toward the western horizon, where another line of dark clouds had appeared beneath the fading evening light. From a distance, they looked promising enough to make anyone believe relief was finally on its way. Yet the wind had already begun shifting in the wrong direction, carrying the storm slowly north before it could reach the Dawson fields. Ben watched the clouds disappear into the distance without saying another word, and for the first time since planting season began, both men returned to the farmhouse with the uneasy feeling that they were no longer waiting for rain. They were waiting to discover how long the land could endure without it. By the first week of August, nobody around Gove County talked about whether the rain would come anymore, because the conversation had quietly shifted toward how much of the crop could still be saved. The hope that had carried farmers through June and much of July slowly gave way to acceptance as one dry week blended into the next, and fields that should have been growing taller each morning instead seemed to stand perfectly still beneath an endless blue sky. Maize leaves remained tightly rolled through most of the day, ears that should have been filling with grain never fully developed, and combines that farmers normally prepared with quiet anticipation stayed parked inside machine sheds because everyone understood there would be far less to harvest than anyone had imagined only a few months earlier. The drought spared no one completely, including Eli Dawson. His sorghum had endured the relentless summer better than the neighboring maize, but endurance was not the same thing as prosperity, and anyone expecting lush fields would have been disappointed. The stalks stood shorter than usual, many heads carried fewer kernels than they would have during an ordinary year, and every acre reminded Eli that even the most resilient crop could only work with the moisture nature provided. As he walked the fields each evening, he felt grateful for what remained while mourning everything the season had quietly taken away, because farming had taught him long ago that surviving a difficult year never meant pretending it hadn't been difficult. Throughout the county, the consequences reached far beyond the fields themselves. Farmers postponed machinery purchases they had planned during the winter. Livestock producers searched farther from home for hay that had become increasingly scarce, and conversations at the local cafe no longer centered on market prices because there was little point discussing prices when so many producers had so little grain to sell. Some families quietly met with their bankers to extend operating loans into another season, while others began wondering whether the coming winter would force decisions they had hoped never to face. The drought had started as a weather problem, but by late summer it had become something much larger, touching nearly every part of rural life. Harvest arrived earlier than anyone wanted because there simply wasn't enough crop left to justify waiting. Dust rolled behind combines instead of the heavy clouds of chaff that usually accompanied a healthy harvest. Grain carts filled more slowly than they had in years, and many maize fields produced yields so disappointing that farmers climbed down from their machines without speaking very much, because there was little comfort to be found in numbers everyone already knew would be disappointing. Eli helped several neighbors repair equipment during those long weeks, and although nobody talked openly about discouragement, he could see it in the way conversations ended more quickly than they once had, and in the long moments of silence that settled over fields where good harvests had once been almost routine. When it came time to harvest the Dawson family's sorghum, Eli approached the first field with cautious expectations because he understood better than anyone that drought-tolerant did not mean drought-proof. As the combine moved steadily through the rows, the yield monitor confirmed what his eyes had already suspected. The crop had survived, but it had paid a price for every week the rain failed to arrive. Even so, something caught Eli's attention when he climbed onto the grain tank to examine the harvest more closely. The quantity wasn't remarkable, yet the kernels themselves were firm, fully developed, and unusually consistent despite the difficult season. He scooped a handful into his palm, turning them slowly beneath the afternoon sunlight, while years of experience quietly connected a thought that hadn't occurred to him before. For months, everyone had been measuring the drought by the grain it had taken away, yet standing beside the combine, Eli suddenly realized there was another loss almost nobody had mentioned. Many neighboring maize fields had produced so little that farmers would struggle not only to recover financially, but also to begin again with confidence the following spring, because a poor harvest didn't simply empty grain bins. It also reduced the supply of healthy seed capable of producing another crop. Looking down at the sorghum resting in his hand, Eli understood that his father had never taught him to plant differently, merely to survive one difficult season. He had taught him to think beyond the harvest itself, and for the first time since the drought began, Eli quietly wondered whether the greatest value of this year's sorghum would not be the grain it produced, but the opportunity it might give struggling farmers to plant again when spring finally returned. Winter settled quietly across western Kansas, but the drought refused to loosen its grip on the conversations taking place inside machine sheds, coffee shops, and kitchen tables throughout Gove County. Harvest had ended weeks earlier, yet very few people spoke about the season in the past tense, because its consequences continued following them into every decision they made. Seed orders for the following spring usually began long before Christmas, but this year they unfolded very differently as disappointing harvests across much of the region tightened supplies, pushed prices sharply higher, and left many farmers wondering whether they would even be able to secure enough quality seed before planting season returned. For the first time since Eli Dawson had taken over his family's farm, the greatest concern wasn't what they had harvested. It was whether they would have the opportunity to begin again. Eli spent several evenings cleaning and storing the best sorghum seed from the harvest, treating the work with the same care his father always had, because seed represented far more than grain waiting inside a bin. Every healthy kernel carried the possibility of another growing season, another harvest, and another chance for a farm family to recover from whatever the previous year had taken away. As he worked, Ben remarked that they had probably saved more seed than they would ever need themselves, suggesting they might sell the surplus while prices remained unusually strong. Eli agreed that the seed had become valuable, but he couldn't bring himself to think of it only as another commodity because he knew too many neighbors whose combines had gathered almost nothing only a few months earlier. The first pickup arrived on a cold Saturday morning just after sunrise. Eli recognized it immediately because it belonged to Harold Jensen, one of the farmers who had joked at the cooperative the previous spring that sorghum belonged in another generation. Harold climbed slowly from the cab, removed his gloves, and stood beside the truck for a moment, as though searching for the right words, before finally admitting that he had been told Eli might still have certified sorghum seed available. He didn't mention the jokes from planting season, didn't attempt to defend them, and didn't pretend they had never happened, because neither man needed to revisit that conversation. The drought had already done what no argument ever could by reminding everyone that farming has a way of humbling people long before another person gets the chance. Eli invited Harold into the machine shed, where they talked for nearly an hour about the harvest, the rising cost of seed, and the uncertainty surrounding the coming spring. Harold confessed that he had spent most of his career believing improved maize hybrids had reduced the need for sorghum on his farm, yet after watching one difficult season erase years of confidence, he wanted to rebuild part of his operation differently. He wasn't asking Eli to solve all of his problems. He was simply hoping to buy enough seed to give his family another opportunity when planting season returned. By the following weekend, 2 more pickups turned into the Dawson driveway, and before long, the visits became frequent enough that Ben stopped asking who was coming because he already knew the answer. Some farmers arrived carrying notebooks filled with acreage calculations. Others came with questions about planting populations and moisture conservation, and a few admitted they had never planted sorghum before but wanted to learn. What struck Eli most wasn't the number of people arriving at the farm. It was the humility with which they came, because none of them spoke as though they had discovered a miracle crop. They had simply learned, through one painfully difficult season, that depending entirely on a single answer sometimes creates a problem that only diversity can solve. Late one afternoon, after the last pickup disappeared down the long gravel driveway, Ben looked across the steadily shrinking stack of seed bags inside the machine shed and quietly asked the question Eli had been asking himself for days. If more neighbors kept coming, would there still be enough left for the Dawson farm when spring finally arrived? Eli rested one hand on the nearest pallet before looking across the fields lying dormant beneath the winter sky. And although he didn't answer immediately, he knew the decision waiting in front of him had very little to do with farming and almost everything to do with the kind of neighbor his father had taught him to become. The closer spring planting came, the more frequently pickups turned into the Dawson driveway because word had quietly spread beyond Gove County that Eli Dawson still had certified sorghum seed available. Farmers who had never visited the Dawson farm before now found themselves standing inside the machine shed, studying neatly stacked seed bags with the careful attention usually reserved for something far more valuable than grain. Some came from neighboring townships, while others drove more than an hour after hearing from relatives or elevator managers that Eli might still be able to help. Although every visitor carried a slightly different story, they all arrived with the same concern because another planting season was approaching much faster than anyone had expected, and the drought had left far too many operations without a reliable way to begin again. Ben watched those conversations unfold day after day, and one evening, after the last truck disappeared beyond the cottonwood trees lining the county road, he admitted something had been bothering him for weeks. Every bag of seed leaving the machine shed represented one less bag available for the Dawson farm if another dry year followed the last one, and although he admired Eli's willingness to help, he quietly wondered whether generosity could become dangerous when nobody knew what kind of season lay ahead. Farming had already taught both men that optimism alone could not fill empty grain bins, and Ben struggled to understand how Eli remained so calm while watching the carefully stored seed supply grow smaller with every passing day. Eli listened thoughtfully, because the question deserved an honest answer. He walked toward one of the remaining pallets, picked up a single bag, and rested it against the workbench, before explaining that every farmer eventually reaches a moment when the numbers and the right decision appear to point in different directions. The numbers said seed had become scarce enough to command almost any price he wished to charge, and nobody standing in that machine shed would have blamed him for asking far more than he had paid only a year earlier. The right decision, however, was something his father had settled long before the drought ever arrived. During another difficult season many years earlier, his father had looked across a disappointing harvest and quietly told him that a good harvest feeds your family, but a great harvest gives your neighbors the chance to have one too. Eli confessed that he hadn't fully understood those words as a young man because they sounded generous without sounding practical. Yet the line of pickups arriving at the farm each week had finally shown him what his father had meant. The opportunity to put those words into practice arrived the very next morning when Harold Jensen returned carrying his checkbook. Harold thanked Eli for setting aside enough seed for his acreage before asking the question everyone expected to ask sooner or later. He wanted to know the price. Eli opened the small notebook where he had written every purchase made during the previous planting season, found the page listing what he had originally paid for the certified seed, and turned the notebook around so Harold could read the figure himself. Harold looked at the number twice before quietly reminding Eli that the same seed was now selling for far more wherever anyone could still find it. Eli simply smiled and replied that the drought had already taken enough from the county without him deciding to take a little more. Harold closed the notebook without another word, reached across the workbench and shook Eli's hand with the quiet gratitude of someone who understood he had been given more than a fair price. Not every farmer could pay immediately, and Eli discovered that reality before the week was over, when two older brothers, who had farmed together for nearly 40 years, admitted they simply didn't have enough cash left after the previous harvest to purchase all the seed they needed. Embarrassment filled the silence that followed because neither man had come asking for charity. Yet, before either brother could apologize, Eli told them to take the seed home, plant their fields, and settle the account after harvest, if the coming season treated them more kindly than the last one had. The older brother removed his cap, looked down at the concrete floor for several moments, and finally admitted that he would never forget what had just happened inside that machine shed, because difficult years have a way of revealing what people truly value long after prosperous years have allowed everyone to hide it. Several weeks later, as spring gradually returned to western Kansas, Eli drove across the county delivering the final seed orders before beginning work on his own fields. Along the way, he passed farms where planters were once again moving steadily across the prairie, and although maize still occupied much of the landscape, something had quietly changed since the previous year. Here and there, scattered across sections that had once held nothing but maize, young rows of sorghum had begun appearing again beneath the wide Kansas sky. Eli recognized many of those fields because they belonged to the same neighbors who had laughed good-naturedly at the cooperative only 12 months earlier. Yet, as he watched the new crop emerge from the soil, he realized the drought had accomplished something no argument ever could. It had reminded an entire farming community that the strongest future is rarely built by placing every hope in a single answer, and as he turned toward the Dawson farm with the last empty seed bags folded neatly in the back of his pickup, he couldn't help wondering what his father would have thought if he had lived long enough to see those fields growing green once again. The seasons that followed gradually erased many of the visible scars left by the drought of 1988, although nobody who farmed through it ever spoke about those years, as though they had simply become another memory. Rain eventually returned, Wheat once again covered the plains with its familiar green in the spring, and maize yields slowly climbed back toward the levels farmers had expected before the weather changed everything. From a distance, Gove County looked much the way it always had, yet anyone who had lived through that difficult season knew the land wasn't the only thing that had changed. The people farming it had changed as well, because hardship has a way of teaching lessons that prosperity rarely can. Over the next several years, more farmers quietly began returning a portion of their acreage to grain sorghum, not because anyone suddenly believed it was a better crop than maize under every condition, but because the drought had reminded them that resilience deserved a place beside productivity whenever decisions about the future were being made. The conversations inside the cooperative gradually changed too. Instead of asking which crop promised the highest yield, farmers increasingly found themselves asking which combination of crops gave their families the best chance of surviving whatever kind of season the plains decided to deliver next. Nobody claimed to have discovered a perfect formula because farming had never rewarded certainty for very long. Yet the county emerged from the drought with a deeper respect for the quiet wisdom of preparing for more than one possible future. Ben noticed those changes more than anyone because a few years after the drought, he rented his first piece of ground and prepared to make his own planting decisions for the first time. On a cool April morning, he stopped by the Dawson farm before heading to the cooperative, explaining that maize prices were climbing once again and asking whether Eli thought the county might be making the same mistake it had made before the drought. Eli smiled because the question reminded him so much of the one Ben had asked years earlier while they planted the first sorghum field together. He explained that the lesson had never been about choosing one crop over another, because every farm, every season, and every piece of land demanded different decisions. The real lesson was remembering that nature never signs a contract promising to behave the way markets expect, and farmers who forget the truth eventually allow confidence to replace preparation. The two men walked across the edge of a field where the soil had already been prepared for planting, and Ben watched as Eli bent down almost without thinking, lifted a small handful of earth into his palm, and gently rubbed it between his fingers before allowing it to fall back where it belonged. The movement looked so familiar that Ben couldn't help smiling because he had watched it countless times over the years without fully appreciating what it meant until he began farming on his own. Eli looked first toward the broad Kansas sky stretching endlessly above the prairie, then back toward the field waiting patiently beneath it, before quietly saying that high prices always tempt farmers to believe they already know what kind of year lies ahead, although the land has a way of reminding them that tomorrow has never belonged to anyone. Ben nodded thoughtfully because this time he understood the lesson without needing another explanation. He no longer saw sorghum as the crop that had survived the drought better than maize, nor did he think of it as a symbol of being right when everyone else had been wrong. Instead, he understood it as a reminder that good farming has never been about chasing certainty. It has always been about respecting uncertainty enough to prepare for it. As the two men turned back toward the equipment shed to begin another planting season, Eli looked once more across the fields before quietly repeating the sentence his father had spoken so many times that it had become part of the way he saw the world itself. "We'll plant what the sky is willing to grow." Ben smiled, climbed into his pickup, and headed toward his own farm because those words no longer sounded like advice from another generation. They sounded like wisdom every generation eventually has to learn for itself, and perhaps that had been the greatest seed Eli's father ever planted because, unlike the grain harvested from any field, it continued growing long after one difficult season had finally come to an end. Perhaps that's why stories like this continue to matter long after the harvest is over. It's easy to believe wisdom always arrives through new technology, bigger machines, or better prices, but every so often, life reminds us that progress isn't about abandoning everything that came before. Sometimes it's about carrying forward the lessons that have already survived generations of experience. Eli Dawson didn't save his neighbors because he grew a miracle crop. He saved them because he understood something his father had tried to teach him years earlier. A farmer's greatest responsibility isn't predicting the future. It's preparing for it with enough humility to accept that nature always has the final word. I'm curious what you think. If you had been standing in Eli's position, would you have sold the seed at the highest market price, or would you have done what he did and sold it at the original cost? I genuinely enjoy reading your thoughts, so let us know in the comments along with where you're watching from. And if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget that I'm putting together a free Last Acre story archive featuring 25 forgotten rural stories, the real historical inspirations behind many of our videos, behind-the-scenes research notes, fascinating historical discoveries, and exclusive story ideas you won't find on the channel. I'll be sharing it first through the Community tab, so make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on if you'd like to receive it as soon as it's released. Thank you for spending part of your day with us here on The Last Acre, where every acre has a story, every field remembers, and the quiet lessons of yesterday still have the power to shape tomorrow. Until next time, take care, and we'll see you in the next story.